So you want to get into fantasy. Hi besties, and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to my first recommendations video. How have I not done one of these before? But this video is basically your guide to all things fantasy. If you're looking to get into fantasy or just for some more recs, this video is for you. I'm just going to be going through some books that I think are more beginner friendly, and then some that are more like intermediate, I guess. Let's just hop in because I feel like this is going to be a long one. We are going to start off with the beginner friendly books. The first book I want to talk about is one you've probably seen everyone absolutely rave about, which is Powerless by Lauren Roberts. This book I feel like is just such a good place to start because it is more romance than fantasy. So I feel like it's just such a good place to start because the world building isn't too intense with this one, and it's kind of like a learn as you go book, which I feel like is really helpful when you're just starting out. So in this world, everyone essentially has a power. There's tons of different ones, like everyone's different kind of in that way, but there are these people called ordinaries who don't have any powers, and they are essentially all supposed to be banished. Like none of them are supposed to exist, but our main girl Peyton is an ordinary actually. No one knows that, but she gets sent to like compete in these trials at the kingdom with the prince Kai, who is the love interest in this, and she has to just hide the fact that she's an ordinary. And this is the perfect time to get into this book because the sequel is coming out soon, so I definitely recommend this one because it is just such an easy and fun read, and you will love these characters so much. And then this series is a little bit more dystopian than fantasy, but I'd still consider it fantasy. We have The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer, the first book, and this is Cinder. This series is one of those ones that was popular many years ago, but it is still just such a good series. The first book is a Cinderella retelling. Our main girl Cinder, she is a mechanic, so like it's the whole like Cinderella thing, the evil stepmother, the stepsisters, the prince, the ball, all of that, and it is just so fun because it's like just such an intriguing world they're in, and there's so much going on behind the scenes, and there's so many good characters. And then the next book in the series follows a different princess and so on, so it's just so fun getting to see these like princess retellings. And this series is just really easy to understand, and it is very YA, so with that it's just easier to comprehend and less like killing people, guts, gory, all of that. Next I have To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo. This book, it wasn't a favorite for me because I started it when I was in a slump, and then I just kind of forced myself to finish it, so it did take me a very long time to read, but I feel like if I wasn't in a slump I could have definitely appreciated it more. This is a Little Mermaid retelling, so our main girl in this is a siren, and the main guy in this is a siren hunter. It's kind of like that. You have a lot of similar aspects to the Little Mermaid, but since she's a siren, it's obviously very different too. And I really like this one because I haven't really read like a siren mermaid pirate retelling, so it was just really fun, and I really enjoyed the characters in this. There were lots of good side characters too, and I felt like it was pretty easy to understand because this is a standalone, you guys. There is like no standalone series out there in the universe, but this is one of them. So with that, the world isn't super complex. So definitely recommend this. It's a great starting point. Okay, and then these two series are technically intertwined, but you don't have to read them together. We have the Kiss of Deception series by Mary E. Pearson. This technically goes before the Dance of Thieves duology, and I would really recommend reading this series because it is so much fun and the characters are incredible. This basically follows our main girl, Leah. She is a princess and she's set to marry this prince, and she runs away. She aborts the mission. She is out of there. You follow her kind of trying to escape this kingdom, and then you also get the POVs of two guys who are looking for her. And something that's really interesting about this book is they just have nicknames in it. I think it's the assassin and the prince who are trying to find her, and you don't know like who's who. Like when you're reading her perspective, you know their names, but when you're in their perspective, you don't know their names. So you kind of have to figure out who's who, and it honestly got me a bit. Like I was kind of caught off guard. I will say about this one, kind of drag out a bit. There are lots of points where they're just traveling somewhere or not really doing anything, just like traveling literally. Once you get to the last book in the series, it is so incredible, and you will have loved the characters so much. Like these characters I think of all of the time. And then technically this goes after that, but there isn't too much correlation. You will maybe get some references and some names, but you don't really have to read it. This one I feel like is more romance heavy and more action packed, and this series was so good. I can't remember her name. She's like an assassin and like a fierce warrior, and they are sent on the mission from their queen to go to this other kingdom. It is probably a little bit more hard to read slash understand than the Kiss of Deception series, but I feel like it's a good build up when you read the Kiss of Deception series first because you already know the world and understand the politics. Definitely recommend reading those. And then we have the Caraval series. There are 3 books in this series. Again, it's not a favorite for me, but I do feel like it is a really good starting point because this one is less politic, kingdom, war focused and more just like magical world, fairy tale, mystery, like you don't know what's true and what's not. I feel like this is a good one to start with because there's lots of interesting characters and it kind of has a more mystery undertone than like a deep politic undertone. It's essentially about this like magical, I'm gonna call it a carnival, but I don't really know. And they get tickets to it and it's just nothing is as it seems there. Like you just have to figure out what's real, what isn't, just everything going on. And the story continues in that same way. After that series technically comes the Once Upon a Broken Heart. Again, you don't have to read the Caraval series first and then Once Upon a Broken Heart, but I would recommend it. There are some things that would get ruined for you. So if you want to go back after you read these and read the Caraval, some things would get spoiled and ruined, but it's not too deep. But I feel like these books are probably the perfect starting point if you want to get into fantasy. They are so easy to understand. There is not a ton of politics. Again, it's kind of just like a magical whimsy world. I feel like it's kind of more character driven than plot driven a little bit. There's just so much that goes on in this series, but it's not really in a complicated way, and it is just so incredibly interesting. It starts off with our main girl, Evangeline. She is supposed to get married to this guy, Luce, and she finds out that her sister is actually going to be marrying him, so she makes a deal with a fate, essentially like a god in this world, to stop the wedding, and she ends up turning into stone for a bit, and then she's just kind of indebted to this fate person, and you just kind of get their journey figuring everything out, and it is so interesting. There's just so much depth behind each character and so much character development throughout this series, and I totally recommend this trilogy. I just want to say sorry in advance for recommending you guys the most like popular fantasy series ever, but if you are on the fence about reading this series, you literally have to. Like, I will force you to read it. The Akhtar series, aka the series that changed my life and that I think about literally once an hour probably. Please read this series. Like, if you haven't, I don't know what I can say besides please read it. Like, you have to. This series has changed so many lives and it will change yours, I promise you. Start off with the first book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, where it is a loose Beauty and the Beast retelling. Our main girl, Feyre, she is a human, but she gets sent to live with the Fae in the Fae world because she shoots a wolf that is actually a Fae person. So she gets sent to live with our main guy, Camelin, in this one. Just know that it is so much more than that. There are trials she has to go through and so much more. I know that's vague and I know that doesn't sound interesting, but I swear on my life that it gets so much better. The first book starts off pretty understandable and easy to understand, but I will say it does get definitely more politic heavy in the next books. The second book is Court of Mist and Fury, aka the best one out of the series. Of Court of Wings and Ruin, a little novella a court of frost and starlight, and then a court of silver flames. Just know it does get a little more complex as the series goes on, but I feel like this book is a great starting point to understand the world. And then we have the Prison Healer series. This series, I absolutely loved this. I feel like it's kind of hit or miss. You either love it, you hate it. Again, the first book in this series starts off really easy to understand and not super politic heavy, but it does get deeper as you continue on the series, so I just want to put that out there. This one is about our main girl, Kiva. She is the prison healer. She's working at this prison, which is essentially a death trap. Like, you cannot get out of this prison. The rebel queen comes into the prison and is super injured, so Kiva is tasked with healing her, and also the queen is set to compete in these like trials. So Kiva takes her place in the trials because the queen is so sick and cannot do it physically. I will say I thought the trials were going to be a bigger part of this series, and it did feel a little rushed, but honestly, I really enjoyed the day-to-day mundane aspects of life in the prison. I thought it was super interesting, and there's so many side characters characters that are incredible. I have heard that it can get a little boring, so that is that. Again, this one is perfect if you are just starting out reading fantasy. We have Divine Rivals. The second one just came out, Ruthless Vows. I didn't even really know it was fantasy at first or realize it. Like, the fantasy elements are really kind of underlying in the first book. You're basically set in this like normal world at first, where Iris is like a journalist at this newspaper, and so is Roman, her rival at this newspaper. They are both competing for the same like promotion at work. So you get kind of like a workplace rivalry, which is super interesting and doesn't really seem like a fantasy at all. But the world is at war. There are two gods in this world who are at war with each other. So that is kind of how the fantasy aspect ties into this. It is so good, and this is seriously one of the best romances you will ever read. Like, the characters together are literally incredible and like mind-blowing. The second one does get more politic heavy. There's lots of info dumping in this one, I feel like, and it is definitely more politic heavy, and you learn a lot more about everything at work in this one. But this series is incredible. Please read it. Also watch my reading vlog on it after you do. And then, if you remember when I talked about the Prison Healer series like 2 seconds ago, the same author has another series called the Madoran Chronicles. This one is probably like the perfect way to start your fantasy journey. I will say this series is like very YA, but I feel like YA fantasy is an incredible place to start when you are getting into fantasy. Whoa.
I didn't get that.
No, Siri, you shut up. These are the second and third books. The first one looks like this, basically the same cover as this one. Don't make the mistake, I didn't buy the second one before you buy the first one, because that is what I did. But this series follows our main girl, Alex, who she is just a normal human mortal girly, and she goes to this boarding school, like a normal boarding school on Earth, and she gets transported to literally another world where there's magic. There's like a magical school she attends, and this series really does an incredible job on the side characters. The side characters kind of make this book. Like, our main girl, Alex, she has incredible friendships. Basically, you just follow her at this magical school where everyone kind of has a different like power gift thing. And again, in this, there are evil forces at work trying to work against our main girl, but you know, you'll find out what happens. But I really enjoy this series. It can get very kind of mundane and boring, but it is still such a good series, and I really am enjoying it so far. Again, I just want to apologize for recommending this book because it is so popular. Fourth Wing, this book seriously is such a good place to get into fantasy. I have heard countless people say that this is the book that got them into fantasy. This book, again, is about kind of like a magical school. This school, they are training to be dragon riders. Our main girl, Violet, she was not meant to be a rider. She was meant to be like a scribe type thing, scholar, but she gets sent to be a rider. You see her going through trials and meeting a dragon. There's dragons in this. The dragons in this are incredible. There are so many incredible characters again in this. The romance is amazing, and there are just no boring points in this book. Like, literally, this book is so action-packed. There's always something going on. You will never be bored, and this is one where you say one more chapter and then you finish the book. Like, it is perfect for beginning fantasy books because it will hook you the entire time, and it does a really good job with the world building, just like throwing you into something and building on as you go, which I feel like is such a good way to learn the world and understand fantasy. I will say the second book, Iron Flame, that gets heavy into the politics. Like, I was kind of lost, I will say that. But this book, if you're really feeling it, read this and don't read Iron Flame. Just saying. Seriously incredible. It's such a good starting point. I have so much hope for this series and where it's going to go. I hope it doesn't disappoint. The last book for the kind of beginner-ish category is Six of Crows series. This series is such a good starting point. I feel like I kind of started with this series. This was one of the first fantasy series I read. This series is more kind of like heisty than fantasy aspects. There honestly isn't a ton of fantasy in this one. It is so interesting, and the characters, this is the best found family you will ever get. You will never top this found family. This book is seriously incredible. A bunch of characters from a different background go on this heist to try and steal just a ton of money, and the world in this is so intriguing to read about and so interesting. And then the last one I want to talk about is the Cruel Prince series. I forgot to get it down when I got all these books, so just pretend I'm holding them. This is honestly, I think, my first fantasy series, and I remember reading this, and the second I finished, I'm like, I need to reread this right now. It's been 3 years and I still haven't reread it, but hey. This one is kind of your classic trope. Human girl gets transported to the Fae world, does all these Fae things. Really love this series because it was pretty easy to understand. honestly, and there is a lot going on behind the scenes and a lot of side plots that I really enjoyed. I feel like this isn't my favorite fantasy, but I feel like it is a lot of people's, and it is so incredible. I feel like it's really detailed, and Holly Black's writing in it is just incredible, and just the way she describes the world and the characters and all of that. There are some parts of the series that really icks me out a bit, just certain characters and how they treated each other. With all that aside, it is an incredible world and book. Okay, last book for the kind of beginner intermediate start point, we have Bewitched by Laura Thalassa. This is more romance heavy, I'd say. It follows our main girl. She's a witch, so she goes to this like witchy like college type thing, and she also happens to unwake this like evil force of magic, and he is telling her that he is her husband, just like I still have questions because this left on a major cliffhanger, but basically she awakens this evil force, and he basically wakes up and is like, you're my wife. Like, you are my wife. Like, obsessively like that. So he shows up to the school. There's been murders all along the campus, and you're kind of trying to figure out a whodunit too. This one is very interesting. I'd recommend it. It is definitely entertaining. It is not one I really think about often or that stuck with me, but it was very entertaining and bingeable. Now entering the kind of more advanced books, like not to say you can't start with these, but just know that you might get a little confused. First up, we have the Throne of Glass series. This series is the best fantasy series I have ever read. Hands down, politic-wise, it is incredible, character-wise, incredible, but it is a massive series. This series, if you start with this, props to you. It basically follows our main girl Selena, who is an assassin, and she is like a very good assassin, but she gets sent to the kingdom to kind of compete in these trials, and if she wins the trials, she is then the king's like personal assassin type thing. That is what the first book's about. Just know it's a lot more than that, and that it gets incredible. There are seriously the best characters in this series I have ever read in my life. These characters will stick with you forever and will literally change your life. That's all I'm gonna say, because I went into the series so blind and it was the best decision ever. Also, read Assassin's Blade first. And then we have, oh, what's this book called? I can't remember what this is called because I got it from the library, so I don't own it. I'll put it here. This one is kind of a 12 Dancing Princesses retelling. It follows around this family. I can't remember how many kids there is, but essentially every year one of them dies. So you're just trying to figure out with the main girl what is causing this, and there is so many twists and turns in this book. It is actually insane, and you don't know what's true in this one. Like, I was caught off guard so many times, like jaw to the floor, like shook at some of the stuff that was happening. And this one is definitely like a darker gothic type fantasy because it is just like those vibes, and it is kind of hard to understand since it is so twisty and turny and you don't know what's true. Like, there's a lot at work, and it does get kind of confusing and complicated, but it was so good and just so entertaining to read, and you just had to binge it. And then we have The Serpent, the Wings of the Night. This series, oh my gosh, I remember reading this and absolutely loving it because apparently I love reading about vampires. The main girl is a vampire, and there are basically like the Hunger Games. Like, she basically goes to the Hunger Games. I kind of want to say she's like the only vampire in this town. Maybe. This series is so good, and I love the romance in this. This one is kind of definitely more complicated. I feel like there's just a lot of politics going on and a lot of stuff behind the scenes that she's figuring out and just everyone is figuring out, but the series is incredible. I think it's Kindle Unlimited still, at least when I read it about a year ago it was, but please read this series, you guys, please. It is so good. Also, Crescent City by Sarah J Maas. This series can get really confusing. There's a lot of info dumping and just politics and a lot going on behind the scenes that you eventually learn. Again, there is so many good characters in the series. Like, I feel like that's the thing with fantasy books, is they all have incredible characters that you will think about forever. The plot in this one is, it's kind of not super plot heavy, and the world is so interesting because there's wolves, vampires, fae, mermaids, angels, literally everything. That makes it a little confusing because there's just a lot of different types of characters and different kind of houses that they belong to, so that does make it confusing, but you just will love the side characters, especially in this book, and their missions are really super interesting, and there's lots of just like plot twists and things you're just shook by. Love Crescent City. And then Nevernight by J. Kristoff. This is a series. I have not continued it yet, but I definitely want to because this book was incredible. This follows our main girl, Mia. She goes to this like school for assassins to train to be like one of the best of the best, like blade assassin people. And when she gets there, you see her going through trials, classes, everything, and there is so much at work behind the scenes in this book. When you get to the ending of this book, it was beyond crazy. Like, oh my goodness, crazy. It's just so interesting learning about the other characters in the school, the classes she goes on, and just like the type of world this is. The world itself really kind of confused me, like just how it worked and kind of just like who was in power and all of that. That was pretty confusing for me, but I feel like without really understanding it, I was able to still understand the book. And one thing I didn't really love was the little notes at the bottom. So it's like when something like politicky was happening, you'd have a little asterisk, and then down below you would have the kind of meaning in the thing. I am notorious for like skimming those because I feel like it just takes you out of the story, and I feel like that's not really how I learn a fantasy world best. So keep that in mind though. That's kind of how it was explained to you a lot of the times. And then we have the One Dark Window. This isn't just a duology, it is completed. I literally have no clue where the second book went, but it was so good. This is kind of a more gothic, dark one. I feel like this is pretty easy to understand. Kind of the vibe of it and just some of the politics make it not super beginner friendly, I'd say. Like there's just a lot going on in this one. But basically, Elspeth, she essentially has a nightmare spirit thing trapped inside of her head. And in this story, there is this mist that is imposing on the town, and the way that they have to stop the mist is by finding these 12 cards. That whole quest that they went on was so interesting to me and so unique. I will say I was a little confused by kind of who was who, and again, like who was in power in this world and just how they related to each other. But overall, this one was actually pretty easy to understand, I'd say. And then the next series we have is An Ember in the Ashes by, I almost said Tahar Mafi, no, Sabaa Tahir. I loved this series so much. I think there's 4 books. They do definitely get more complicated as the series goes on, but this one is a great starting point. So Leia, her brother is arrested for treason, it says on the back. So our main girl Leia, she makes a deal with the rebels to go undercover in the kingdom as a spy in exchange for them helping her find her brother. Just the whole idea of her being undercover in some like high stakes like military school was so interesting to read about, because seeing the things she had to do to stay undercover and how like hard it was seriously so interesting, you guys. Basically, she meets a guy, Elias. I literally love him. Like, I love him. I really recommend this series. It does get really kind of intense and politic heavy towards the end of the series. You also get introduced to more characters, so it gets so much more interested and you get so invested, and the ending of the series was really, really interesting and crazy and something I did not expect, but it was still so good. Okay, you guys, that is all of my fantasy recs, most of them. I don't know. Let me know if you guys want more like just recommendation videos, like romance, thriller, whatever you want to see. Let me know down below, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.